What's going on, Samson Strength Coach Collective listeners? It's your host, Anthony Grasso. Today, we got an awesome episode with Scott Kuehn, who is a manager of applied sports science for LSU Football. In this episode, we break down a ton of different things, and he gives you a variety of different ways to identify problems within lacrosse, football, specifically team sports, ways to provide the solution. Specifically, we cover his webinar on Strength Coach Network, which is the case study using GPS to influence football practice design, and his white paper they did on Lacrosse, LAX-Score, Quantifying Team Performance in Lacrosse, and Exploring IMU Features towards Performance Enhancement. This one is awesome. Scott has a myriad of experiences that have really shaped the way that he thinks and the way that he goes about things, and I'm really excited for you guys to get a chance to listen to it. So let's get into it. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Samson Strength Coach Collective podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Grasso. Today, we are joined by Scott Kuehn, who is the manager of applied sport science for LSU Football. Super pumped to have him on. Obviously, some of you are probably familiar with his work. We are going to break down some of those things today, but just to give you a quick background on Scott, he's got his bachelor's in exercise science from Illinois State University, a master's of science from Tulsa in mathematics and science education. His certifications got a CSCS and his SCCC. Some of the places that he's been: LSU, Arizona, William & Mary, Tulsa, Acceleration Sport Performance, Kentucky, Matia Valley High School, right? I got that one right. All right. And just to give you kind of a brief overview of some of the publications, I thought this would be important to run through because we are going to break down, some of the things that he's done around GPS and some of the work that he's done. And I want to kind of preface this by saying that this is going to be somewhat of a sparker of interest in the hope that you guys will be able to take some of the information here and then, decide this is, there's obviously much more to what we're able to cover in this hour podcast, and that you can go dig deeper down the rabbit hole and find the answers you're looking for. But the publications, he has a case study using GPS to influence football practice design, Google Sheets Data Management Part 1 and 2, which can be found on the Strength Coach Network, and LAX-Score, Quantifying Team Performance in Lacrosse and Exploring IMU Features towards Performance Enhancement. So, Scott, welcome. Pumped to have you on here. Appreciate it. If you kind of just want to take us through your story as to where this whole thing started and how you got to be where you're at now, obviously at down in Baton Rouge.
Yeah, so I knew very, very early on that I wanted to work in some sector of sport performance. I was athlete all through my youth, and then I played college football ultimately. And I got exposed to the place I ended up working at, Acceleration Sports Performance, when I was in middle school. And I thought it was fascinating that there was a science to improving as an athlete. There was a very vested interest for me, obviously, being an athlete. And I just thought that was fascinating that there was a science to it all. And so that set me kind of down that path very, very early. And I was very fortunate that the people that I trained under when I was an athlete were very, very progressive and, steered me in the right directions towards resources to look into, books to read, people's ideologies to explore more. And so they kind of really, set the foundation for a lot of the ideologies that I hold as a practitioner today. And so, flash forward a little bit more, I got to my junior year of college at Illinois State. I was playing football there, and I read an article from James Smith on Elite FTS, and he was talking about a lot of the underpinning concepts that now make up the Governing Dynamics of Sport Preparation book that he put out. And I'm reading that, and I'm comparing and contrasting it with my experience as an athlete there, and I'm, in my head, I'm saying, what he's talking about makes a lot of sense, but what we're doing is almost diametrically opposite to that. And so that kind of, that was my red pill moment, if you will, where I began pouring through anything and everything that he put out, or, similar people as far as the way that he thinks and preparation. And so that led me to finding the videos. There's some pretty famous videos of Eric Corum talking about the way that they were training athletes at Kentucky in 2012. And I stumbled on those in that same year. And that was one of those, there's actually people that are doing this or attempting to do it. And so that kind of always, or I guess it began to operate as kind of my North Star of, what to look towards, where to kind of steer my learning efforts and what have you. Flash forward 3 years later, I finished playing college football, looking for jobs. I get a job as a head strength coach at Matia Valley High School, which was a tremendous trial by fire, just getting chucked in the deep end of, hey, you've got 200 athletes and you've got to write programs for 3 levels of football. Have fun. And so learning how to, command a room when you've got 80 athletes in there and you're the only coach for them was a very, very good formative experience. And it was one of those, I thought I had it pretty well together. And I get to summer workouts with them, and I see Eric is speaking at the CVAP seminar out in Richmond. And of course, fresh off of being a broke college student, I beg, borrow, and plead with my parents to help me fund a trip out there just to hear him talk and maybe get the chance to speak with him. Go out there for the conference in July. He speaks. I, fangirl the entire time because it's, everything that I've kind of built up in my head is like, this is the way that we need to approach sport preparation. And then the thing that I love about the CVAP seminars, there's a very casual social hour after it's done. So, there's good drink, good food. You just hang out, you sit at the table with other practitioners that are very, very like-minded and realize that CVAPs is, one of the top conferences you can go to, in my opinion. And Eric sits down at our table. Of course, I'm like white knuckling, nervous. And then he gets up to leave because I think he was going somewhere else that night. So he was only staying for the night. So I followed him out and I tapped him on the shoulder and I stammered my way through telling him that I was a really big fan of what they were doing at Kentucky and I'd love to come be a part of it if I could. And so he said, send me your details, your application materials. And so I sent them to him that night, of course. And the next day he asked me if I want to come down to Lexington to work with them for the 2015 season. And so 2 weeks later, I moved to Lexington to work under him. And that was if you are kind of familiar with that Dunning-Kruger effect curve, that was the swift plummet into that trough of I know nothing. Just seeing how it was operating, understanding and realizing the complexities that go into running an entire organization, especially one that is, there's nothing bigger than a football organization, especially when you're at the upper echelons like the SEC. And so that was a very, very formative experience. I built a very, very good rapport with Eric during my time there. Went home, applied for GA positions. That's when I worked in the private sector again, got the GA position at Tulsa. Flash forward another 2 years. I'm applying for jobs or looking for jobs. And I reached out to Eric and he offered me the opportunity to come work for him full time at William & Mary. And him being in the big chair at the administrative table, and obviously just the opportunity to work under him again and be paid to do it was a no-brainer. So I went there, got to work alongside my now best friend, but one of the most brilliant minds in sport preparation, in my opinion, Kuehn Wenham Flat. And we really tried our hardest to bring the high performance model for sport to William & Mary. And we saw tremendous results that we'll get to in a bit regarding that paper and the deployment of this model within the women's lacrosse team there. But again, that was one of those experiences where I felt like a small fish in a really, really big pond, constantly being around Eric and Kuehn and the things they can talk about and riff on and the way that they think. I spent 2 years getting everything that I did, shredded in the best way possible. And I tell everybody I was comfortable in the best way possible for 2 years because they held me to such a high standard, and that really forced me to grow as a practitioner and learn how to truly do this at the highest level possible.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Get to the end of my time there. I move on to Arizona, work with the football team during the pandemic season. That's what led to that case study that I laid out on Strength Coach Network. Unfortunately, we weren't good at football, so I was not retained. So I stayed and worked on the Olympic side there, worked with diving, men's and women's tennis, and women's soccer. Great experiences to be able to step back for a second, work on some other, side hustles, if you will. The warm-up template that I put out, and a couple other pieces, got more into building dashboards during that time. So it was a good way to kind of build up some of those supplemental income sources. And that led me to a very unexpected opportunity here at LSU. And so now I'm here. I'm full-time as, over all of our sports science technologies and, how we collect that data, how we analyze, how we interpret it, how we visualize it. So I'm responsible for managing a lot of the different pieces that go into, what we're going to end up talking about in terms of our sports science ecosystem.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's an awesome career path. I think what I was thinking when you first mentioned that you came across some of James Smith's work when you were like, what was it, college? I think you said, it's like, I wish that was kind of like where my trajectory was. Like I knew about some of that stuff in college. It wasn't too long after that, but yeah, for any like young college, student out there, anybody who's kind of like buried in the curricula of what like exercise science typically is in the standardized education format, to actually get exposed to some James Smith work would probably just be like, like you said, blowing your mind, right? Like just kind of like dumping on everything everything that you thought you've known over the past, however many years of learning, whatever it is that you thought was valuable. So that must have been a little shock.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate that, a lot of his work is still very, theoretical in nature, because I think teams are generally afraid to, take that plummet into what he advocates for from a sport preparatory standpoint. But,
yeah,
at the very least, his work provides in my opinion, one of the best North Stars that practitioners should be aiming towards as they do this profession.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, RIP to the conclave and global sport concepts. If anybody's out there who's that we're referencing the governing dynamics of coaching. So if you haven't read that, anytime I get a chance to plug that book, I will. So there's another one. It's probably like the 17th time I've done that on this podcast. But anyway, so yeah, moving into it, right? Obviously, I really wanted to have you on because I like your take on some of the ways that you can utilize data and just GPS in general. Not only to just kind of like reframe the way that you approach practice and some of the things you guys have found, but also providing your thoughts on how we need to just view GPS in general, right? Because I think a lot of the times, and these are some mistakes that I've made in my career, is when you get really excited about something and you think that there's massive change that you can make, you almost go all in on it to the point where you lose your filters a little bit and you're kind of like here, right? And then after a while, you take a step back and you zoom out and you're like, oh, so here's actually how we can use this tool. And maybe it needs to be more of a backdrop versus an actual driver, or maybe it's just a conversation starter as opposed to an actual decision maker, like things that affect. But I want to hear your thoughts on that. And obviously you can kind of like dig it and kind of groove it into what we talked about, where you provide your definition, your thoughts on what it truly means to build a sports science ecosystem from scratch.
Yeah. So again, inherent to what I was exposed to with Eric and the way that, he was doing his job at Kentucky. Of course, I had these impressions being a, young, halfway through my bachelor's degree, wannabe coach at the time, of what I thought it was. And I really did at that time think, oh, it's about like having all these technologies. And that was kind of where I stopped. It was just being more scientific, more data driven. And that was what constituted high performance. Go to the seminar, and it must have been his third slide. After it was like the title slide, his thank yous, it was what high performance is not. And he listed every technology that they had at Kentucky. And it was like, oh, that's a little bit different from what I thought, or my impression was of, the high performance model. But he goes on to illustrate that high performance is about collaboration with all the stakeholders. It's, there's so many entities that have a hand on student athletes, or athletes if you're at the professional level, that if they don't know what the other hands are doing, you can end up with these opposing forces acting on the athletes. So what the sport coach wants to do may work in opposition to what the strength coach is trying to do, may work in a different manner to what the dietitian, the sports psychologist, the athletic trainer. And so it really fundamentally came down to the collaboration piece, and having this is something we talked a lot about at William and Mary, was having a shared model of reality, which comes from Ray Dalio's book Principles. And it goes back to the kind of the story from the Rig Veda, which is a Hindu text of 4 blindfolded men are made to feel various parts of an elephant. They've never had an experience of what an elephant is before. And the guy feeling the tusk thinks it's a spear. The guy feeling the trunk thinks it's a snake. The guy feeling the belly thinks that it's a wall. And the guy feeling a leg thinks it's a tree. By the merits of what they are experiencing, they aren't wrong. They just don't have the fuller, more comprehensive picture, because they aren't, kind of collaborating to come together and see what it actually is in front of them. And so that's where a lot of, what we tried to do at William and Mary, and what we've been able to do here at LSU is use these sports science pieces, not to be in the driver's seat, because at the end of the day, I always say you should be data influenced, not data driven, because humans are complex organisms. As a coach, you should still be able to, if you want to, and I always think car analogies work very, very well in sport prep. As a coach, you should still, if you're going to get on the road and take a road trip, you should still have a general sense of the direction you need to go. Sports science is your dashboard, your console that provides more information about the direction that you're headed in. Let you know when your gas tank's running low, how fast you're driving, how far you're going, all those different pieces that help you to make sure that, you don't run out of gas and get stranded on the side of the road. If a check engine light's on, you see that and you get your car looked at. And that's really what it is. But at the end of the day, as practitioners, we should still be able to look at our athletes and know, oh, they're not doing well today. Or, hey, they're bouncing off the walls. It's going to be a great training session. Let's push it. And so I always go back to that, I think what's made me successful, apart from the mentors that I've had and the things I've come to learn through those mentors, has been that I was a coach first. I am a coach first and foremost. I can interact with my athletes, have conversations with them that aren't just, oh, here are your numbers. They see me as a coach here, which tells me I'm striking the right balance when they call me coach. Because by, the definition of my position, I'm not technically a coach here. And so you still have to be able to look at your athletes and kind of piece that whole picture together of what you're seeing from the athletes and what you're kind of, interpreting about their body language, your interactions with them, how they're moving when you're out on the field. And then the data just, supports or underpins that. And it also serves as a centralizing hub for when you go to have conversations with other stakeholders in the organization to say, okay, first day, here's what our workload looked like. It was comparable to a game, but we did it in half the duration of a game. And so, if you're going to invest in the technology, you don't want to just let it go to the wayside and not act on anything. If you can, point out, hey, we did a game's worth of work in half the time, that's a very intense starting point, which is typically what you see in college football preseasons, that the first 2 days you come out, first few days, I should say, and they're game-like, and then you inevitably just trend downward because guys either get hurt or they get, completely burnt out way too quickly. And you end up detraining into the season. So that's where it helps centralize everybody. The data is what it is. At the end of the day, the sport coaches are still going to make the decision that is what they perceive to be best for the organization and for the preparation of the team. And that's what you ultimately have to defer to. But, kind of like we talked about, we'll get to, how can you present the story to them to have that story come across to them and for them to act on it in a pragmatic way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you made a few great points there, and I won't, go back through all of them, but obviously the idea of being, data influenced, right? And also with that, that kind of leads us right into what my next question was around and you can kind of, take the reins from here and just go into whatever you would like to go into. If you want to start talking about the specific webinar that you did on Strength Coach Network about using GPS to data, influence, kind of how you guys structure some of your practices, and then, the ways that you guys kind of used it to filter your thoughts and guide your decisions. The heuristics that you had set out for like how you were going to tell the story, right? And how you were going to present this data to coaches. What were some of the things that you guys found what were some of the huge major benefits, right? Like some of the things you guys took away, like, hey, this is what we were able to do from a performance and an injury reduction standpoint or whatever the case may be. And how you guys kind of went about doing that. If you wanted to kind of start diving into specifically the GPS webinar and how you kind of, utilize some of that data to start making some of your decisions.
Yeah. So when I went to Arizona, that was during the initial first year of the pandemic. So it was just, nobody knew what was going on. Things were constantly changing. It was just sheer chaos. So I was going out there knowing the Pac-12 had already said, we're not going to play a season this year. And it was just, there's an opportunity to go to Power 5 football, narrow my focus as far as not having so many teams and having to service so many teams from the data science role I had at William & Mary. This is a chance to advance my career in the direction that I ultimately want to go. And so we get out there and I kind of had this, buffer of we're in off-season mode and, kind of mentally settling into this is going to be a once in a lifetime, 14-week off-season for football. And this is a chance for me to kind of, very slowly assimilate into that organization, figure out how I want to go about doing this job. And then the SEC announces they're playing football. The Big Ten announces they're playing football, and the Pac-12 rolls it back and says, actually, we're going to play football. You've got 6 weeks to get them ready. And, I was very fortunate that my boss at Arizona, Brian Johnson, he had done a lot of legwork prior to me arriving there to get the coaches into some semblance of a tactical planning model there that was oriented around the stoplight system. So green practices, yellow, red. At the time, they were doing it on a period by period basis. And so, he knew that I had a specialty working with GPS system. And so when they announced that we were playing, he, tasked me with putting together the model for going from, I think at the time because naturally football coaches got bored. And they wanted to start, doing small skill sessions with the guys. So we were doing 3 40-minute skill sessions a week, in addition to a full off-season training, which is like, they would have been like great model if you have a 12-week off-season like that, in my opinion, to keep them developing and improving at football while physically developing them. But so we had to go from 3 40-minute sessions a week to, in 6 weeks, we're squaring off against USC on ABC and playing a full football game for 4 hours, 3 hours, whatever it is. And so I was really fortunate that a lot of the pieces that we had been trying to do at William and Mary, as far as bringing athletes back from the pandemic and from the quarantine, really set a good foundation for me to look at how we design our build into games. And so I think we found out we were playing on a Friday or a Saturday. I went and spent like 8 hours on the Sunday putting together all these different permutations of plans to present to Coach Sumlin, who was the head coach at the time, and allow him to make the decision on how we go at, getting them from the point we were at to the point we needed to be at in 6 weeks. And so I laid out pros and cons of each plan. And the thing that we learned and discussed a lot at William and Mary, from what we were putting together as far as the reacclimatization plan, was that you need to have kind of hard and fast lines as if you're going to provide like parameters for sport coaches as far as practice design. You want to make it very, very concrete. So there's no room for interpretation of, well, I thought it was this. So like an easy example is if you say this practice should be a 6 RPE. The sport coach's perception of what a 6 RPE practice is versus, all things considered, what actually manifests can be grossly different things. And so rather than base it around, RPE or, aiming for certain player loads, we thought the easiest way to go about it, or I thought the easiest way to go about it would be just let's constrain what we do by duration and then have a framework for each day of what we want to how we want to structure the physical environment of the practice to drive particular adaptations that will physically prepare them for a mini season. And Kevin Sumlin recognized that, this was a hopefully once in a lifetime, never before seen scenario where you didn't have the normal buildup that you have of spring football, summer training, fall preseason. So we can't go at it the same way that we conventionally go at it, is what he said. And so we were very lucky that one of the what we ended up settling on was I advocated for kind of this like microdosed approach, if you will, to start our preseason, where we went 60 minutes start to finish. That wasn't, they're out there 45 minutes before doing skill work. That was, they're walking out and we're toes on the line starting, and then they're all up 60 minutes later. And we use that time to kind of install this rebranded framework that I put together, to where we had green practices that were speed oriented, more about the quality of the work. And so the volume was inherently a little bit lower. We had yellow practices that were about developing specific work capacity, so playing above the demands of the game. And then that coincided with doing things like working, small space scenarios. So your third down, your red zone, your goal line, working more of your return teams, whereas the green days were more about your coverage teams, open field concepts, and getting the guys max velocity exposures through practice. And then obviously inherent to that is that you can't just train that way 5 days out of the week and then go play a game. You have to have recuperative days or install based days. So we just kind of presented it to them as the net output of teach sessions you get, install segments, full speed segments, what have you, is the same at the end of the week. You're just allocating more teaching, more install segments to our red days, and you're doing more, huddle concepts and open field concepts on your green day, and you're doing more short yardage, up tempo concepts on your yellow day. And so rather than have the coaches try and keep track of, again, how I alluded to, the previous system was on a period by period basis, they would have colors rather than having them try to worry about, oh, this period's a yellow period, I've got to, and not necessarily having a clear cut definition. We just made the entire day to drive adaptations towards those same qualities in the football context. And so then we gave them kind of very simple, pragmatic ways to elicit those outcomes in all facets of their drill. And so I made up kind of a sheet that like, oh, for individual drills, have guys go one at a time rather than in groups, because now the rest that they're going to get is going to be longer. So the quality and the speed of execution that they're going to be able to output is going to be higher. Conversely, on your yellow practice days, rather than doing a typical routes on air segment where your guy runs one route and then you have the next guy go up, run it up tempo and get them 4 to 6 reps in a row with one quarterback, and then let them walk back and coach them. Simple things like on green practices, coach them between reps. So you kind of bake in the extra rest. On yellow practices, let them get their repetitions in and then coach them. So we got this, kind of almost block, if you will, and it was blocked on a day-to-day basis of, red days are very technically tactically intensive, but they're not physically intensive. And they kind of lay the foundation or the dress rehearsal for our speed day. Obviously speed, you want to train early in the week when you're freshest. So that was our Tuesday practice. Back that up with our yellow practice on Wednesday. Thursday was a complete walkthrough, and then we do a fast Friday on Fridays going into the game. So it was super short, fast, have them hit speeds, do a little bit of a potentiation session prior to the on-field portion, and then we go play. And again, I think that, you mentioned, how do you work with sport coaches or bring these things across them is, you very fundamentally have to remember they have a myriad of other pieces that they are keeping tabs on. They've got recruiting, they've got disciplinary issues, they've got game planning, scheming, they've got to find their drills for practice. There's a lot going on for them. And so if you sit there and you try and overcomplicate how you're reporting to them or how you're providing structures to them, you're just a blip on the radar of everything that goes on for them in the day. And, I always tell people, I think I had an Instagram post about it, but you've got to effectively think like you're making an elevator pitch to sport coaches, and you've got, just arbitrarily, let's say you've got 60 seconds for the story you're telling to land and for them to arrive at the conclusion that you want them to arrive at. So if you bog them down with a bunch of different tables and graphs and, this really impressive looking report, that I tell everybody, I think you've missed the mark on reporting, because they need to be able to pull out the story very, very quickly. And so, what I talk about in the webinar is that we focused on 3 kind of fundamental metrics. We focused on a volume metric, a density or a work rate metric, and then an intensity metric. And then to put it into a context they understand as sport coaches, how do those values compare to game demands? So I ran all kind of an analysis on the previous season, because we had the same offensive coordinator. With defense, obviously it's pretty, you're at the mercy largely of the opposition that you're playing against. So you can't necessarily pin down, these are the demands of, this defense, because if you're playing a triple option team versus an air raid team, the imposed demands are going to be vastly different. But, so we kind of pinned down what are the player loads for starters at each position group? What are the average work rates or densities, player load per minute during games? And then for intensity, we used sprint distance. So that was anything over, kind of going in line with Charlie Francis's notion that if you are going to operate in medium intensity, you should classify it as high intensity. So we said anything 75% or over was sprint distance or intensity. And so we looked at how those values compared to game demands. And again, it puts it in a context they're familiar with. So you can come out and say, and then we conditionally formatted all the bars to align with our color system. So I pulled from some of Fergus Connolly's recommendations from Game Changer in the process, as far as like, okay, obviously on your green practices that are about speed, you have to inherently have a little less volume. So let's just arbitrarily put it between 40 to 60% of the game. And so anytime the value flags between 40 to 60%, color it green. On the yellow days, you're trying to get a little bit more volume. So let's call it 60 to 80%. Red, below 40%. And so then they could see really, really quickly on the report did we hit a green day? Did we hit a yellow day? Were we above, below the mark? How did that play out? So they can really, really quickly pull out the story that's being told from that practice session.
Yeah, this is okay. This is awesome, Scott. I really appreciate it. It's funny because I'm looking down at my notes and it's like you're literally covering every single thing that I took like from the webinar. And anytime you mix like James Smith, Charlie Francis, and a lot of Fergus Connolly stuff together, I mean, I'm all jazzed up now. So this is super cool. And that's what I was actually going to ask and kind of lead in with was, obviously the idea of themes, right? And I'm a huge fan of the themes. I thought, like you said, creating it so that you had a theme for the day as opposed to each period. I thought that was super beneficial. Going back to kind of like the framework that you had in place, right? Like I've got, in the early part of your webinar on Strength Coach Network, you talk about, you reference some of these papers, and obviously you need to take a look at like, what is the actual game itself, right? So how did you go about kind of taking a look at, because I have here the analysis of exercise to rest ratios during Division 1A televised football competition. And there's a couple other papers and articles that you referred to as competition modeling for American football, and then an updated review of applied physiology of American football, specifically taking a look at work, normal rest, extended rest, and then the series rest, huddle versus no huddle, right? Like these are all like different things that you lay out, and it actually opened my eyes to certain things. I think it was, Andy Ryland was like, oh, well, huddle versus no huddle isn't exactly as, far apart as people think, right? And you don't have to take us through specifically those, like, if people want to really go look at what those numbers are, the work to rest ratios of American football. I think a lot of people have heard them. It probably wouldn't be a bad idea to just revisit them quickly, but also just kind of moving into like, how did you go into communicating this to the football coaches so that they were like, oh, okay, so here's the framework that he's basing this off of when he's telling me I need a fast day, a day, a red day, or a yellow day, right? Like here's where Scott's basing some of this stuff off of, right? And here's the data that because I think the one thing you do so well in the webinar, and I actually texted one of my friends immediately when I was watching him, who's also going to be kind of, taking over some of the catapult duties that I used to have at UConn. I was like, you got to watch this, because what he does is he does a really good job of like simply identifying a problem, right? I think a lot of times we're very quick to provide solutions now, right? We want to be able to, because to us, the problems are clear, right? It's like, well, here are the problems. We're doing things that are nonsensical, right? But you do a great job of providing like visuals of like, hey, here's what happens after an intense practice, and then how it comes into, it's going to move right into high fatigue, and then you're going to get some injury, some illness, and a lack of performance, and then we're just back into another high intensity practice. Like, these are things that, like you said, in 60 seconds, a sport coach could look at that and be like, oh yeah, okay, so that is a problem, that we have a problem, right? So, and then you went about providing the solution based off of some of that framework. So if you kind of want to touch on that, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that in particular.
Yeah. So, I think the thing that is most illuminating from that work to rest ratio paper, it's essentially, time motion analysis, is the series rest. Average is 11 and a half minutes, standard deviation of 4.5 minutes either way. The minimum they saw in televised Division I football games was 4 minutes. And, inherent to that is that extended rest amplifies the intensities that you execute at, and then obviously factoring in, arousal state of a game, what have you, that amplifies the intensity of execution that players are going to go through. But if your practices are just a steady stream of reps, what ends up happening, and what my experience was playing, is that your mindset is, okay, what do I got to do to survive? What do I got to do so I don't get, called out for loafing on this rep? But I also don't go full tilt knowing I've got another 3 hours of practice to get through. And so, one of the things that was kind of incumbent to revamping the tactical planning framework that was at Arizona prior to my arrival there, was that we needed to present on it. And we needed to lay out like, okay, here are the issues. And so some of those pieces that were in that presentation were part of a PowerPoint that I put together for the coaches to explain, here are the considerations, here are what the demands of football actually are. And here's why having these, themed days supports the development of these qualities that you say you want in your athletes. You say you want them to play fast. You say you want them to be able to, repeat high intensity outputs. You've got to provide a physical environment for those things to happen. And that kind of segues very naturally into the work that we did with that Lacrosse paper. So I think it was a good jumping off point for that. So the fundamental basis of that paper is that we had a bunch of data on the Lacrosse team. They were the first team at William & Mary that we worked with to roll out this high performance approach. And I was very, very fortunate. The sport coaches I worked with there, the athletic trainer I worked with for that team, everybody was very, very bought into this approach. And we also happen to be just like really, really good friends. We're still really good friends. We still text in our staff chat to this day. But it was like first time doing anything like this for any of us. And so we had a bunch of data around the program. We had GPS data, we had heart rate data, we had Omega Wave. And we had a contractual agreement with our computer science department at William & Mary we could just shove them our data and say, do something with it. And so we kicked around ideas with them on like, here are some potential like rabbit holes to go down with all their data. They went away for a few months and they came back with this paper, and they had created this what they called LAX-Score, which is effectively a one sum value that tells you how well you performed in a game. So if you think through the kind of reverse logic of how do you win? You score more points than the other team. So goals scored and goals allowed are a pretty heavy factor. How do you get opportunities to score? Take more shots, minimize their opportunities to shoot. So now shots taken and shots allowed are another factor to consider. How do you get opportunities to shoot? Possess the ball more, minimize their ability to possess the ball. So now you're looking at turnovers and cause turnovers. And they also factored in ranking differential and turnaround time between games. And then they weighted the ranking differential and the goals scored and the goals allowed more highly than the other variables. So then you could see how well did we perform in a given game. What they then did is, because there I was in charge of the practice design for the lacrosse team as well, I pulled a lot. Mladen Jovanovich's website, tremendous series on planning and team sport. And that was like the rabbit hole I went down over my winter break in 2018. This isn't football where you've got this weekly rhythm that you're working through. Our turnaround time for that season was anywhere from 2 days between games to 12 days between games. So you can't just have this, okay, it's a green practice on Tuesday, it's a yellow practice on Wednesday. You have to have a very fluid and iterative framework that kind of like lets you know what the objective is on particular days. And then you adjust the content to fit within that. And so there was another great, I want to say it was from work by Raymond Verheijen, that just looked at like, okay, what should your overarching practice themes be for 2 days between games, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I adapted that to kind of the tactical model that we were deploying and that I built out at William & Mary with the lacrosse team. Was I just laid out all the turnaround times that we had for that season. And then, okay, where can we have high intensity practices based on, physiology, sound tactical planning principles? Where do we need to have more endurance practices? Where do we need to have recovery practices? And where do we need to have more like potentiation type practices or priming practices? And so it was kind of this, you got to have good heuristics to work from in terms of doing this. So it's really easy to, you need to prioritize planning for the next game. And you still have to respect the physiology of what's happened in the previous game. So more often than not, you're not getting an opportunity to practice at high intensities because the average turnaround time is like 4 days. So typical research around recovery times from team sport, it obviously varies depending on the demands of the game. But what's been seen, and the most I could approximate from the current research available is to liken it to kind of soccer, where they say it takes about 3 days to recuperate from a game. So, if we don't have more than I believe it's a 5-day window between games, we can't have a high intensity practice. So we just kind of laid out this framework, and then on a week by week basis, I would lay out, here's kind of the duration of practice that we should have. Here should be some of the objectives to accomplish within that practice. I would speak in terms of like how much field space we should practice on. So high intensity days, full field practice. Endurance oriented practices, half field. Recovery or like walk through, jog through type practices, keep it to the restraining line and in. So they're not running high intensity, changing direction at high velocities, and so we just kept it very simple to that. And, the thing I impressed upon them is games are a developmental stimulus. So you can ride the adaptations that are made from the most specific training stimulus you can possibly get. You can ride that into your next game and just rely on being fresher than other teams who think they've got to practice hard. And all you end up doing is inevitably just digging the hole deeper and deeper, and then you're broken by the end of season. And
Yeah. Scott, before you go on, sorry, not to interrupt. Can you run that back? That's a great point. That's really eye opening, and I want to give you a chance to even just if you could just literally just repeat what you just said. I think that was super valuable, and that's probably gonna be eye opening for not just football or lacrosse, but any team sport.
yeah, games are training stimuli, and they're the most specific applied training stimuli you can have your team go through. But I think it generally gets regarded as like, oh, well, it's the game. Like, it just is what it is. It's this, fairy tale land, what have you. It doesn't matter in our developmental process. But, the thing I impressed to our coaches was that's the most important one. So we need to make sure that the way that we design our weeks facilitates adapting to games so that they get fitter as time goes on, and they get fitter in the way that is, most relevant for them to get fit. And so then back to the paper, what we ended up doing was looking at the different themes of days that we had, and they looked at the GPS and heart rate features of those types of practices, and then they were able to identify thresholds of certain metrics that if we hit those on a particular practice type, it increased our game grade or decreased our game grade accordingly. So like one of the things we pulled out, this is one that I always make reference to, is when we had our high intensity practices, it increased our game grade if it was a 2 to 2.5 hour practice. So now going into next year, we can say, okay, when we have high intensity practices, it needs to be between 2 and 2.5 hours. And, I can provide the input on that based on, what we have going, where we're at in the season, what have you. But we know that if we do these things, it has an impact on our game grade. And the takeaway from that paper that I think should resonate the most is that we were looking at purely physical variables, mechanical and physiological variables, GPS data, heart rate data. But they bore an impact on things, sport coaches ultimately care about: winning games, scoring goals, getting opportunities to score, possessing the ball longer. So the physical environment, the physical structure of your practices bears fruit for what you ultimately see emerge on the practice or on the competition field. And that was the thing that I think what was coolest to me was that, we're looking at things I really, really care about, but it's being applied to things that the sport coaches and, I do as well, because if they don't win, obviously it's a little bit different working with a women's lacrosse program. You're not necessarily tethered to the coach and going to lose a job if they don't perform well. But you should still care about the outcomes for your team. And, so those are the things that we ultimately care about. And we saw tremendous improvements. We won 50% more games than they did the previous year. We were far more competitive. So you looked at the scoring differential of games that they played the previous year to games we played that year. Our injury rate was down 83% in season, and we had no soft tissue injuries, no catastrophic knee injuries, and they were averaging anywhere from 1 to 5 catastrophic injuries per season the prior 5 years. And we had one girl's coming off her third knee, and she was playing defense for the first time. So obviously much more demand, frontal plane, transverse plane, where ACLs occur. She played every minute of every single game without re-injury. We had massive improvements in their physical qualities. So their speed, their strength, their power. We ran the 30-15 IFT for conditioning. Their scores went through the roof on that in the off season. And then the most important appraisal point to me was that the head coach I was working with at the time said it was the first time in her coaching career she didn't want the season to end. Every other year she was just excited to be done with it. And the girls all said it was either the best year of their life or their favorite lacrosse season they'd ever played. So by all accounts, objectively and subjectively, we made marked improvements. And it stemmed from the very fundamental piece that I talked about at the beginning of we collaborated together. We took good ideas that I had, good ideas that the coaches had, good idea that our AT had, and we made them better because we worked together to find the best solution for everything that we all advocated for. We were synchronized about it because we had these centralizing hubs of the dashboard that I created and I presented on Strength Coach Network. We had this thing telling us what are their workloads currently, how are their bodies responding to it from their wellness score. And it all very fundamentally went back to that piece. And that is ultimately what high performance is. And what I want to convey is that when you have egoless stakeholders who they want the best, they're willing to work together to find the best solution, all things considered, that is where the magic really, really is. And that is what we saw come true with that lacrosse team. And, we were able to demonstrate that we can improve game outcomes from the way that we practice and the way that we collaborated on developing our practices.
Yeah, this is amazing. This is awesome. I'm really appreciating this right now. I think one of the most important things to point out, obviously, is what you finalize. And I think it's funny because we don't always, like, I think as coaches, like, and as humans, right, like a lot of like some of the best humans I've worked with who are coaches are always like, hey man, like at the end of the season, like I had, a bunch of the female lax players or a bunch of the football players say like, hey, we're, we really enjoyed this, like this was so fun, like I'm gonna miss this, I'm gonna miss you, we want to make you proud, you know what I mean, with some of the things that we do in the future, that kind of thing, right? And it's always like, yeah, that's usually like the typical focal point, right? But what you led in with was obviously like, all right, from a data standpoint, like we need to make things happen. Like we probably need to win games, right? Like in order for some of this stuff to actually matter, right? And I don't know if I always believe that that's true. Like I think when you're like setting a framework, like what you did at Arizona is like, well, let's just get to a place where like we can actually maybe change the way and like the lens that we're looking at and viewing college football preparation through, and then kind of like see what happens. Like people are going to win and lose regardless of like what's going on, right? And then like, James Smith always says like you're either winning in spite of or because of what you're doing. And, a lot of times in college football, it's probably been, in spite of. But I think what you were trying to allude to is like, I'm going to figure out a way to make the data and some of the things that I want to, like some of the metrics we're looking at, actually relevant to some of the sport outcomes, right? Like you said, like these things are actually having an impact on goals scored, goals allowed, right? Like these are things that like coaches they're gonna perk up. Things like, oh, so there's a connection between that and when we're winning games, and if we're winning games and how we're going about winning games. So that's fascinating. And then I think, yeah, obviously, like you said, the fact that at the end of the day, the end of the season, the coach was like, I don't want the season to end. And the players are like, this is the most fun that I've had. Right. And so I think that's awesome. And I'm going to, we'll, at the end of this, I'll plug that one more time, obviously, because I think that the paper you did on Lacrosse, and then obviously your GPS design or GPS webinar on Strength Coach Network is fascinating stuff. And like I said, and I'll say this again to all the listeners, what we're able to cover in this short segment is not enough. I wanted to be able to at least, get something in here that was going to spark the interest, to be able to give you guys an opportunity to then go search it, go read this paper, go on Strength Coach Network, go, I don't know what Keir's, doing right now as far as prices go and all that stuff. Just go on there. I mean, he always figures out a way to get you access to the things you need to get access. Go watch these things, take notes, ask questions, whatever it is. I'm just fortunate enough to be able to have you on here to be able to answer some of these things. But, and the effort to try to keep things short and sharp. You've got about maybe like 5 to 6 minutes left. Is there anything else that any major things that you, Scott, feel in your mind, like obviously you're super passionate about this stuff, and it really, I don't know, I could just see it. I could see it in your eyes. I could see the way you obviously and hear it in the way that you describe it. And you belong in the place that you are. And I'm happy that people like you are occupying those positions. Is there anything else that you feel like really compelled to try to get the message out there to any of the listeners?
Yeah, I think everybody. So one of the very influential books that I read is Thinking in Systems by Donnell and Meadows, and one of the quotes that I always take away from it, or that I refer back to, is that a system's purpose is deduced from actions and behaviors, not stated goals or rhetoric. And you go to every single college, university, and you look at like their mission statement on their website, and it always says that they're athlete centered. And I think the mark is often missed on that because there aren't the fundamental pieces in position within those organizations to where there's either siloed approaches that don't ensure that everybody's working together very, very holistically, and there aren't structures in place that make sure that everybody's kind of getting at the table and hashing out what's going on and figuring out where they're at and where they need to go. And a lot of the pieces that people preach in terms of leadership dynamics or growth dynamics, as far as like having a growth mindset, you don't often see those pieces actually present themselves. So when you go back to that quote, you can say you're athlete centered all you want, but our role as practitioners is to figure out how to truly make it athlete centered and realize that I think one of the big takeaways I had from my experience at William and Mary was that even though we were all new to it, and looking back, there are things we got wrong and we just missed on, but because we always left the meeting room on the same page, and whatever decision was made in that meeting room was a decision we went forward with as a staff. And so, the girls couldn't ask the head coach one thing and get a different answer from me or different answer from the athletic trainer. And so that really, forced their hand of, getting in alignment and rowing in the same direction. And so, we have very grandiose ideas in this profession about how sport preparation should be approached. But you're not always going to make the 100% shift in the direction that you want it to go. So you have to recognize that ultimately, what's the most important piece that I want to have in place. And then, something else may not be right or may not be exactly the way that I want it, but it's going to play far better with the athletes to, be in alignment with the coaches, and then gradually work over time towards ensuring that, or towards, getting those things moving in a better, different direction that you have a vision for. So it's, a lot of this is, I was very fortunate that I came into a situation where the coaches' hands were kind of forced because they were in year 5 and they hadn't been winning. So the condition for them getting their 6th year was to deploy this high performance approach. So their hand was forced a little bit, but in, almost all scenarios, you're not going to come into a situation like that. So you have to be willing to make incremental progress and, be forward facing to the athletes that the way that the direction the program's going in is the direction. Because, the takeaway I had from my time at Kentucky was when people can sense a divide and they end up taking up sides, that erodes even when things were, as good from an objective standpoint. They had all the data research. Practice model was very well done. It didn't work because the interpersonal dynamics were off, because there was a divide about which approach should be subscribed to, this more, progressive high performance approach, or the old school, just, shut up and train and practice hard type approach. And so getting those dynamics right, even if it may not be right objectively from a preparatory standpoint, is going to be far more facilitative of success than if it's objectively, governing dynamics to a T being deployed in your organization.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think these are just, like I said, time and time again, this is just awesome. This whole thing was awesome. Obviously, Scott, everything that you covered, a ton of valuable information, great messages. Maybe we could do this like a part 2, maybe after the football season or something like that. We get you back on and some other things. I'm sure you're probably going to come across a ton of findings, obviously, in this upcoming season with everything that you guys have got planned at LSU. And yeah, man, I'll definitely be rooting for you guys. But again, just another plug just to make sure that all the listeners know where to go find this stuff. Strength Coach Network, case study using GPS to influence football practice design. And like I said, the paper that we talked about, LAX-Score, Quantifying Team Performance in Lacrosse and Exploring IMU Features Towards Performance Enhancement. Scott, again, just to finish this thing off, I really appreciate it. And then that last message about, it doesn't really matter how great or how technical the plan that you have is set forth. If obviously everybody's not on the same page and everybody that, it just, even if it's not perfect, if everybody at least believes in the overarching philosophy and understands the principles that you guys are trying to push towards, it's a much better framework for success than having the most perfect plan that nobody's actually believing in. So,
yeah, I mean, sometimes being athlete centered is about, making concessions on pieces that, yes, if you look at it objectively and you ask 10 other practitioners, they would agree with it. But sometimes it's just better to that synchronicity and that shared model that's being deployed to the athletes, and see it as a more long-term mission to make incremental progress in the direction you think sport prep needs to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, that's going to wrap it up here. We really appreciate it. Like I said, maybe we can get you back on sometime after football season when things die down a little bit. Wish you the best of luck, and yeah, we'll chat again soon.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, no doubt. Thanks, Scott. And for the listeners, till next time, we'll check you later.